Dear diarrhea full of shit. Just play along, me, myself, and I. No one else. Yo, I'm so legit. Stumbled across a short. Um, I stumbled across a few of these every now and then. I have some of them saved in my private nostalgia. Um, like retro stuff. Back in the being a kid in the '90s. And I'm a millennial, so I kind of had 2 decades, of my life when I was like a little kid, and then when I was like an older kid, and when I got my license to drive when I was 16, and when I was 18 and 19, and in my 20s and stuff like that. So I've got a few of those saved, but and they really are nostalgic, because things were different. That's why I like, if I could digress for a minute here, that's why I like old movies, because they have multiple levels of nostalgia. And I'm a really nostalgic guy. Most people are nostalgic, but I think I'm more nostalgic than most. And I'm like a unique kind of nostalgic, because I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I'm a fairly unique guy. In some ways that's good, in some ways that's bad. Not bad for me, but bad, like, generally speaking, people might look at my life and be like, man, I could never be you. And I'm thinking the same thing. I could never be you, you know, um, just for every reason. The way you think and internalize the world. I like to use that word, internalize, how you perceive it. And, because everything you see and hear, a feeling comes with that. And little by little, these feelings kind of shape who you are, and yeah, there's a genetic component to that, but there's also, there's some nature component to that, but there's also nurture component to that. Where you grew up, who your friends were, who your peers were, not necessarily your friends, but just people you hung out with. When you went to the grocery store with your parents, what kind of conversations did you hear and things that you see, as a kid growing up. This all shapes who you are. And of course, your teachers and stuff, back in my day, they just taught. These days, everybody's got an agenda. And it's a different world. The game has changed, with social media. Everybody having a little computer in their pocket all the time, and it is a different world. And as another, so that's that. And as another side note, I remember being a little kid going to libraries and stuff, thinking, I wonder how much information in all these books is like a little bit off or just straight up wrong. It's just something that I thought as a kid. I'm sure most of it is, generally right. And, of course, now you get what you get, with gaslighting and, controlling the narrative. And now AI is on the scene, and it's it's a new game, Jack. I've said this before. I said it a long time ago. Um, there's two phrases that I've coined 100% on my own, and I'm sure many other people have said them, but I've never heard them. The first one is shallow yet conclusive, ignorant yet self-approved, which is like describing that's a negative saying regarding closed-minded people. Who think with their ass instead of their head. Hey, Mrs. Butthead. She does that all the time anyway, good, bad, or otherwise. You're still mentioning Mrs. Butthead? She comes up from time to time, yeah. But and every 5 years, the world is beginning to change, and every 10 years, it's a new game, Jack. So, but I stumbled across this thing, I think it was, Prices in the early 2000s. And it showed, like, I didn't watch it. I guess I could, but, I just didn't really feel like it. I'm sure I could type it in and it would pop up. I guess I could save it, my private nostalgia, just for whatever. But it showed a house. You could buy like a starter home. I'm assuming a starter home for like $120,000, and you can't really do that these days. I don't know what a starter home would be. What, in the mid 200s? I don't even know. I'll have to ask my sister because she lives in a starter neighborhood. A starter neighborhood is like, smaller houses, made for, or, younger families, with lower incomes and stuff like that, and they can borrow less, because to borrow money from the bank, it's a big damn chunk of money, so they want to know what your job is, your yearly salary, your monthly salary, how much you're worth, and all this stuff. And your assets, if the shit hits the fan, and you lose your job, how are they going to get their money? And then there's the concept of, turning the house back into the bank and all this, stuff. But it got me thinking, when I was 20 years old, I was going to buy a house. I needed to ask for a loan for it. I didn't have that kind of money just laying around at the time. But, I had enough money stockpiled away and a good enough job at the young, naive, up and coming age of 20. Not even old enough to drink, old enough to go to war, old enough to smoke cigarettes, but not old enough to drink. Old enough to vote. Anyway, and it was like it was a one level. I think it may have been like a modular home. I'm not sure. But yeah, I was going to buy it. It was going to cost me $97,000. So I needed to ask for a loan. Because number one, I mean, you don't want to wipe yourself out. You know what I mean? It's like, even if you had the money, it's like you don't want to that's just not wise. You know what I mean? Because then it's tied up in a mortgage. So you're better to just accept that as a fact. It's a monthly. Yes, you're going to pay, your interest, and you're going to end up paying, because that's how they get their money. Make their money. They're not going to loan you $10 and you're going to pay back $10. They're going to loan you $10. You're going to pay it back, 25 cents at a time. But when you're all said and done, you end up paying back, $15 or something like that. Sounds reasonable. Yeah. I'd have to ask my future bestie Cool Breeze. He was an economist and he's just a generally smart dude. Haven't contacted him yet. Maybe I'll do it today because I guess he's back. He was helping a friend, deliver a car. So I just followed him and I guess gave him a ride back. Cheaper than flying, I guess. Not quicker, but cheaper, maybe? You got to factor in, the fuel and wear and tear on your tires and, just all that stuff. But mainly it's the fuel. That's the biggest cost that, everything that you do kind of moves that meter forward, you know what I mean? Insurance can be a little tricky. Like sometimes an older car is actually, it depends on what type of car it is, but I mean, generally, anyway. And they got the statistics, they got the stats, like people in red cars tend to get more speeding tickets, so insurance companies factor that in, and numbers don't lie, say what you will. And insurance companies are not your friends, neither is the bank, neither are credit card companies, and neither is the medical industry, So that's that. But anyway, so yeah, I was gonna, live in that house for a bit, and I decided not to because I was a dumb fuck. I'm like, I don't want to be locked down, the house. I wanted to just do the apartment thing and this, that, and the other. In hindsight, I wish my dad would have sat me down and said, look, this is a good plan if you want to do this. And maybe he did, and I just don't remember. I mean, my parents were good parents, but there are times, I think back in history where maybe they could have been a little bit more stricter on the rules. And sort of, had a little bit more talks with me. Just in hindsight, I'm not, I mean, they were great parents, unconditional love and support. But when I do think back, like I said, that would have been a prime example. And maybe he did, and I just don't remember, because I was stubborn back then. It's like, fuck it, I don't care, I'll just work and save money, and I had my mutual funds and all that stuff. Fuck, what the fuck I want to do this, flipping houses shit and whatnot, But So I can totally see myself saying that, like, fuck, I don't care. You know, I want the freedom to move around. I don't want to have to live in this place for the last 5 years. And, but yeah, that would have been a good thing, is to like live in it and then sell it, when it was on a seller's market or something, and do minor improvements to it, that wouldn't cost me a lot of money, do it myself, make sure when I sold it, it had a nice new paint job, and, everything was, you know, good to go. Same thing with land. They're not making any more of it. People who just buy land, and it is a selfish thing technically, because somebody could be living on that land and starting a family, and raising kids, and having a dog. The family dog is important. And this, that, and the other, and but a lot of people, that's pretty common. They buy land and they just hang on to it. So, and a lot of times they'll, kind of sell it off in chunks, little by little. That's what happened with the property that I'm on. The guy who owns it lives like over the horizon, and it was like, 55 acres. And first he sold it, to my neighbor's catty corner here. And then they carved out, I don't know how many acres they have, and then they carved out 10 acres for me, and there's another 35 acres. But I feel sorry for the person who buys that, because the way that my land is set up, let me draw you a picture real quick. So anyway, hindsight's always 2020, that shit, whatever. And, that's something that is an option for people, who are like in a bad way, downsizing, sell your house, and buy, just a smaller shit, if you didn't save for retirement or something, and it, I don't know how it works. Like if you don't have your house paid off yet, I'm not sure. You might just be out willy nilly, but your house is like an investment, and I don't really understand the concept. Well, I do understand that. I guess equity is like, if your house was paid off, it's how much you would like have left over. And I don't really fucking understand it. All these fucking fancy words and terms and conditions. Like I said, I always figured, fuck it, not interested. Just pay it forward. Just show up with cash. Fuck you, not interested in your fucking interest rates. Not interested in your, buy now, pay later. Because, it's always, the consumer ends up losing. It's like you have to do that, because maybe you have to. You're stuck between a rock and a hard place. I get it, loans and stuff like that, but I just, all these, I just, fuck you, miss me with that fucking shit. So, but anyway. But there's a lot of people that's not a luxury for them. So they understand all that shit, but I don't. Because I always just showed up with a cash. They're like, oh, we have a finance program to buy this couch, Because there are people out there who can't afford furniture because everything's fucking expensive as hell. So I'm the type of guy who's like, I'll just, won't have a couch. I'll sock away money until I have the money, show up, buy the couch, or, for $500 or whatever it is, and walk out the door with it. But there's other people, who are like, it's not an option. It's like they can't put away that money, or they could, but it would take them forever. So they're like, okay, let's buy the couch. We'll do this finance program, and then we're going to have to end up paying a little bit more for the couch. But there's a lot of people out there, it's not an option. But I've always been, Joe Blow, loner, introvert, just me, myself, and I. So I've just quietly, been doing my thing, and it's, it has its advantages. But anyway, so here's what this property looks like. This is a rough drawing. Yeah, it's something like that. It's something like this. So the owner actually lives like over the horizon over there. This is a road. This is the road I live off. This is just other shit, you know, like here's a neighbor who lives over here. I got a neighbor who lives kind of over here. We'll say I live like right here. This is my property. It's more shaped like a rectangle than a square, but I've got 10 acres. Then I've got some neighbors who live right here. And for all I know, their property actually extends out more like this, you know, down like that. But they've, you know, and then there's, so first this guy, you know, had this property, sold it to them. Then he sold this to me. And then there's this property that's shaped like this. But this is an easement, you know, for the power company. And this is like easement for both of us to use because this is how both of our driveways get to our houses. So this person is going to pay for all of this fucking land, but they won't be able to use this or this. And then over back here, they'll end up having like 35 acres, you know, which is a decent amount of acreage. And they've got an easement back there because they've got a water line that runs. So that's like junk property, right? It's like, you better get that for a damn good deal. Now, they do have water rights back there. You know, that's hard for me to explain because I don't really necessarily understand. I just have like a well, right? I'd have to googly boog it. You can yourself too if you want to, your online family and friends. But basically, I don't know. It means they could like plant crops and stuff, and you know they've got access to more water. But like I said, I don't know what the fuck it's only 35 acres, you know, and like I said, they're landlocked, you know, so this is public use for us, you know, meet them and them, you know, our driveways are there, so they've got water rights, but it's like, what the fuck for? You've got 35 acres. What are you going to put up hay? You going to open up a tree farm? No, you ain't going to do shit. You're landlocked. You know, so that is, in my opinion, that is shit property. And that guy's going to have a hard time selling it. Anyway. And they're like an older couple, and I don't know what his financial situation, if he's working, not working, what he did, you know, this, that, and the other. But yeah, that chunk of land shaped like, yeah, it's junk, you know.